I survived the horrifying trap of my own mind's self-destruction after my home became a living nightmare of a trapped, crying child. But the real terror began months earlier when I brought a heavy, antique oak wardrobe into my bedroom. The delivery men left the massive piece of dark wood against the far wall, and its deep, suffocating smell of damp lacquer immediately filled the room, making the air feel thick and heavy. That very first night, the silence of the house was broken by a muffled, high-pitched whimpering sound that seemed to leak directly from the rear plywood panel of the wardrobe. I sat up in bed, staring at the imposing dark shape in the corner, while the faint, rhythmic crying continued for 3 straight hours, until the morning sun finally filtered through the blinds. The next evening, the disturbance escalated from faint whimpers to the unmistakable sound of tiny fingernails desperately scraping against the rough interior wood of the closet. I approached the wardrobe with a flashlight, pressing my ear against the cold, polished surface, and my heart raced as the frantic scratching moved rapidly from the bottom corner up to the locked door handles. When I tried to pull the brass handles open, the doors remained stubbornly jammed shut, and a sudden, sharp thump from the inside rattled the entire wooden frame against the wall. I backed away slowly, clutching my arms, as a tiny, pale, bloodless hand suddenly slipped out from the narrow gap beneath the bottom drawer and clawed weakly at the carpet before instantly sliding back into the darkness. The sight of those small, shivering fingers sent a wave of panic through me, prompting me to search the kitchen drawers for keys, screwdrivers, or anything that could pry the heavy doors open. Every tool I used failed to budge the ancient lock, while the crying inside grew louder, shifting from a soft whimper into a frantic, breathless gasp for air that echoed off my bedroom walls. By the third night, the relentless scratching was accompanied by violent, heavy thuds against the wooden panels, making the entire massive wardrobe rock back and forth on its wooden legs. I stopped sleeping entirely, sitting on the edge of my mattress with a flashlight trained on the bottom gap, waiting for the pale hand to appear again, while the muffled, suffocating gasps grew increasingly desperate. The smell of old wood in the room began to morph into something sour and oppressive, forcing me to throw open the windows to let the freezing night air inside. As the wind howled outside, the crying inside the wardrobe suddenly turned into a series of sharp, panicked screeches that sounded exactly like a toddler trapped in a small, sweltering space. I grabbed a heavy metal crowbar from the garage, determined to end the torment, and began hammering the tool into the seams of the wardrobe. But the wood only splintered slightly without giving way. With every strike of the crowbar, the scratching on the other side became faster and more chaotic, as if the occupant was running out of time and oxygen. I screamed at the wardrobe, promising to get her out, while the tiny, pale hand thrust out from the bottom drawer once more, this time smeared with dark, wet streaks that looked like blood. The sheer terror of seeing that desperate hand drove me to a state of absolute frenzy, and I ran to the basement to retrieve my heaviest sledgehammer, dragging the massive iron tool up the stairs. I could hear the crying fading into a weak, raspy rattle that signaled the absolute end of the victim's strength. I raised the sledgehammer high above my head, ignoring my trembling muscles, and brought it down with all my might onto the center panel of the wardrobe to destroy it once and for all. The heavy iron smashed through the thick oak doors, sending sharp wooden splinters flying across the bedroom as the structure began to collapse under my frantic blows. I struck the wardrobe again and again, screaming and crying in a blind panic, until the entire back panel fractured into pieces and fell flat onto the carpet. I dropped the heavy sledgehammer and fell to my knees, frantically tearing away the broken planks of wood to grab the child I was certain was dying behind the barrier. As my hands tore through the debris, the sound of the howling wind outside suddenly seemed to fade, replaced by an absolute, suffocating silence that made the room feel completely empty. My vision slowly cleared of the dust, and my eyes adjusted to the reality before me, revealing that there was no broken wardrobe, no splinters, and no child trapped behind wood. I was sitting on the cold, hard linoleum floor in the corner of an empty, dusty spare room that had remained locked for the last 6 months. My hands were not holding splinters or pulling a child from a closet, but were instead clutching a small, faded pink wool blanket and a tiny pair of baby shoes. The heavy sledgehammer was nowhere to be found, and my fingers were actually bleeding from clawing at the bare, empty plaster wall, until the wallpaper had completely peeled off. The severe mental breakdown that had held me captive for months suddenly shattered, forcing my mind to finally confront the horrific reality it had desperately tried to block out. There was never an antique wardrobe, and there was no supernatural child scratching behind the wood to escape a dark, enclosed space. The frantic, suffocating gasps and the desperate clawing for air were the exact, painful memories of my baby girl, whom I had tragically lost during the peak of summer. I remembered the blazing July afternoon when I drove to the local shopping mall, completely distracted by my phone and a long list of errands. I parked the car under the direct, scorching sun and walked inside the air-conditioned mall, leaving my sleeping daughter strapped securely into her car seat in the back. For 3 agonizing hours, I shopped, chatted, and went about my day, completely forgetting about the helpless infant trapped inside the metal greenhouse of my vehicle. When I finally returned to the car and opened the door, the blast of intense heat and the sight of her lifeless, pale body sealed my fate in a single, devastating second. My brain, completely shattered by the unimaginable guilt and the horrific truth of my own negligence, had constructed the illusion of the trapped wardrobe child as a defense mechanism. The hallucinatory wardrobe was my mind's twisted way of forcing me to relive her final, desperate moments of scratching at the windows. And suffocating in the heat, I sat alone in the empty, dark room, rocking back and forth on the floor while clutching the tiny shoes, finally feeling the crushing, unyielding weight of the truth. There was no rescue, no second chance, and no way to repair the devastating consequence of my fatal distraction. The agonizing silence of the empty house settled over me, leaving me alone with the permanent, painful realization of what I had done. One last question. If you were in her place at that moment, would you have done the same? Be honest. What does her choice deserve out of 10? Subscribe now. The best story is coming next.